Welcome to Module 21 of Interpersonal Communication, the Forces of Romantic Attraction. Why are we romantically attracted to some people and not to others? That's a pretty good question. And at first glance, you might say that's an impossible question to answer. After all, who can explain why it is we're attracted to some people and not others? It all seems so mysterious. It all seems as if it's magical. And for many people that have experienced that, it often does feel magical. Nonetheless, researchers have tried to explain what it is that attracts us to people. And that's why in this module, I think it's appropriate, having talked about the research on communication in a romantic relationship, that we go back to the beginning and we look at some of the research on what attracts people in the very first place. Now, before we get into that research, let me say this. What we're about to talk about is the research on attraction, specifically romantic attraction. That is to say, we're about to talk about research about the kinds of things people do, the kinds of qualities they have that make other people notice them and stirs romantic interest. It's attraction. We're not talking about falling in love. In fact, falling in love is a completely different concept. Psychologists have actually done research about different kinds of love and about the notion of falling in love, but it's a very different concept than what we're about to talk about. To begin with, the whole notion of falling in love implies a label of some kind. There are certain feelings that you have towards someone that you label as love, and by attaching that label, you better understand it. What we're about to talk about, on the other hand, is just raw attraction. Just this feeling that you have that makes someone stand out from other individuals. Let's put it this way. Attraction is what initially draws us to someone. Love is how we feel after we've been drawn to someone. And so, having said that, let's talk in a very basic, rudimentary form about the research on the forces of romantic attraction. Let me start with the category that we might call personal qualities that influence attraction. And what we mean by personal qualities is going to be a little bit different than what we mean by other people's qualities. By personal qualities, we mean how we see ourselves, because how you see yourself has a rather large role to play in whether you find other people being attracted to you. So let's again go back to Romeo and Juliet. Let's talk about Juliet. Juliet is likely to have a view of herself that either increases or decreases her attractiveness to other people. So for example, there is research that finds that if Juliet feels that she has something to offer other people, that she has rewards to offer other people, then she's more likely to be seen by other people as attractive. So what does that look like? Well, if Juliet thinks she's physically attractive, if Juliet thinks she's a good catch, if Juliet thinks she's the kind of person that would be a great girlfriend to have, then that gives her a kind of confidence. That gives her a way of seeing herself that is likely to color the interaction she has with other people. So when Romeo comes to the window in the balcony scene of Romeo and Juliet and he says, hark, what light through window doth break, or something like that. When Romeo talks to Juliet, Juliet is making herself more physically attractive by perceiving in her mind that she has rewards to offer Romeo. Now that's interesting because there's other research that finds that in some ways we are attracted to one another in ways that we don't understand based upon how we see ourselves. For example, when females interact with males in a way in which they think they are pleasing the males, then females tend to see themselves as more attractive. And conversely, males also tend to see the females as more attractive. So there's this idea of confidence. There's this idea that says, if I feel like I have something to offer, you're more likely to feel it too. And because you feel it, I have reaffirmed my notion that I have something to offer. So it creates kind of a cycle that builds on it. And confidence is one of those ideas that as a personal trait, when we feel it and we exude it, it's noticed by other people. And that in turn tends to make people more physically and otherwise attractive. Now, we'll talk more nearly about the research on physical attractiveness, so let's cast that aside for a minute. But the point of the matter is, self-concept and how we see ourselves plays a very important role in the characteristics that we have that make us appealing to other people. Now, by the way, there's an entire way of looking at this called social evolutionary theory. Now, we're not going to talk a lot about that because it's a very deep idea that has all sorts of manifestations that are well beyond this particular course. But suffice it to say that social evolutionary theory believes that human beings have as its overarching goal the desire to propagate the species. And so to do that, you got to reproduce. So the idea then is that both males and females, because of the long history of evolution, are looking for people with whom to mate so that they can produce offspring and thus propagate the species. So the idea is that males tend to be attracted to physically attractive females because the idea is that physically attractive females will allow males to reproduce, and that benefits the species. Females, on the other hand, tend to be attracted to males that have resources, power, or money, or security and safety, and because that allows them to reproduce and then propagate the species. Now, why am I talking about this? Well, I'm talking about this because this line of thought argues that at some level we understand this. At some level, Juliet knows that males are looking for females that are physically attractive, and so she tries to present herself communicatively in that way. Likewise, males know that females at some level are looking for people that have resources, that have income, that have the ability to provide and protect, and so they try and communicate in such a way as to create that impression in females. And I share that with you finally simply to give you a flavor for the breadth and depth of the research. Some people are studying things like confidence and self-assurance and how those qualities make people attracted to us. Others are studying social evolutionary theory to talk about those kinds of considerations. Next are what are called other people's qualities that influence attraction. Now let's turn it around and talk about Romeo and Juliet, not from Juliet's standpoint, but from Romeo's standpoint. What does Romeo see in Juliet that attracts him to her? That's an interesting question. Well, let's talk about physical attractiveness to begin with, because it probably comes as no surprise that one of the things that we would hope other people see in us is physical attractiveness. And it's true, physical attractiveness is a powerful determinant of romantic attraction. What's interesting is that some of the research on physical attractiveness is cross-cultural research, meaning some research has tried to answer the question, are there certain attributes that if a male or female has them, those attributes are likely to make them romantically appealing, whether that exists in Southeast Asian culture or Scandinavian culture or North American culture? And the answer is yes. So for example, we know that for males, females tend to find males attractive if males have a strong jawline, if they have kind of a triangle shape of shoulders to waist, and if they are physically fit. That's true whether you're talking about females in Southeast Asia, females in North America, or females in Australia. If they see these characteristics in males, they're more likely to see the males as attractive. Likewise, when we talk about females, a so-called hourglass figure and a softer jawline and being physically fit are all the kinds of attributes that if a female has them, a male is likely to find that female attractive. And if a female has that in Southeast Asia or Scandinavia or North America or Australia, a male is more likely to find that female to be attractive. Now, related to that also is this notion of a halo effect. A halo effect is a well-known psychological principle whereby people infer positive characteristics that are intangible because they see positive characteristics that are tangible. So if Romeo sees that Juliet has an hourglass figure and a soft jawline and she's physically fit, he might think that she also is kind and trustworthy and honest. Now, being honest and kind and trustworthy has nothing to do with an hourglass figure or a soft jawline, but because of those positive, tangible, external qualities, Romeo is inferring intangible, internal qualities. We also know that when it comes to this idea of other people's characteristics or other people's qualities, that their communication skills are the kind of thing that also influence attractiveness. So if Romeo and Juliet are interacting, Romeo is looking for certain kinds of communicative skills that are more likely to make Juliet attractive. So for example, warmth is one of them. When Romeo and Juliet talk, if their interactions are warm ones, if Romeo feels a good positive vibe about it, if Juliet can make him laugh, if the conversation is smooth and easy and not forced, then you have a warm environment. And in that context, Romeo is more likely to think that Juliet is physically attractive and she is just generally attractive. Also, we know from research that in Juliet's, from Juliet's perspective, if she is sociable, if she is pleasant, if she knows the social graces, if she doesn't interrupt, if she apologizes when necessary, if she laughs in the right spot, all of these kinds of communicative skills are the type of thing that make her more attractive to Romeo. We also know that sense of humor is important. People that demonstrate a sense of humor, and especially an appropriate sense of humor that's matched with someone else's sense of humor, then they tend to be seen as more physically attractive. So the qualities that Juliet might have communicatively that make her attractive to Romeo are these things such as warmth and a sense of humor and sociability. To the extent that Juliet lacks those things, she's less likely to be perceived as attractive in Romeo's mind. Now, one question researchers have also tried to ask regarding this notion of other people's qualities is the so-called hard-to-get phenomenon. One of the things that's interesting is that people rate members of the opposite sex as more attractive if that person is moderately selective. What's interesting to me is the more selective people are, the harder they are to get, the more attractive we think they are. And ironically, the more attracted we are to them, right? If people are not selective in their person, if they'll date anybody, if they'll go out with anybody, then we tend to be less attracted to them. So there is something to the hard to get phenomenon. Now that doesn't mean that Juliet wants to completely turn down Romeo. Far from it. But what it means is that Juliet can't be seen to be perceived as too eager. Because if Juliet is seen to be too eager, then that's likely to make her less appealing to Romeo. What Juliet wants to do is find the sweet spot between so selective that she's unattainable, but being so unselective that she'll go out with anybody. So the sweet spot is in the middle in terms of her being attractive to Romeo. Third, let's talk about so-called interpersonal chemistry. Now, as soon as we talk about this, we're talking about a really strange area of the research because so much of it's idiosyncratic. I mean, why Romeo and Juliet have chemistry and two other people don't is really hard to determine. But that said, there is some research that allows us to make a few comments about that. Let's start with that idea we talked about earlier when we talked about friendships. When we talked about the research on friendships and how they are formed, we said that similarity was an important consideration. People tend to be friends with individuals that are more like them. That's called a homophily effect. The word homophily is basically looking for similar characteristics between you and someone else. And there's a lot of research that finds that we are attracted to people that we perceive to be similar to us. We're attracted to people we think are similar to us in terms of our level of physical attractiveness. We're attracted to people that we think are similar to us because of the color of our skin, or because of our religious values, or because of where we are in the life cycle, or because of where we're headed in life, or because of an intangible, hard-to-define feeling that they are in some way like us. Now, it's true that idiosyncratically, each of us have our own window, if you will, of similarity. For some people, it's like this, and you have to be really, really similar to me, or else I'm not going to feel attracted to you. For other people, it's a much wider window, and there can be some differences between you and I, and I'm still attracted to you, but there's still a fair bit of similarity. And so what we find communicatively is that people are more likely to be seen as attractive if they can find ways to communicate that similarity. That, of course, can be done both verbally and non-verbally. So if Juliet wants herself to be seen as attractive in Romeo's eyes, Juliet must find a way to communicate to Romeo that they are similar. Now, we've just finished talking about the initiation and experimentation stages of romantic relationships. These forces of romantic attraction play a very strong part in both the initiation and the experimentation stages. And in fact, it's in the experimentation stages of romantic relationships that a lot of this research really becomes important. And it's where the research gets plugged in. So as Romeo and Juliet move from the initiation into the experimentation stage, that's when Romeo and Juliet are figuring out how much similarity there really is. By the way, it might seem rather self-centered to say that we look for people that are similar to us. After all, maybe we're not that great, and so why would we want people to be similar to us? Well, the answer to that is in what's called a reinforcement model. The reinforcement model suggests that in fact we do look for people similar to us because by interacting with people similar to us, it reinforces the views we have of ourselves. So, if Romeo sees himself as a mature, he's got it together kind of a guy, he's likely to be more attracted to Juliet if he sees in her that she too has got it together and is more mature. He sees that in part because he wants to have reaffirmed the value of and the positive nature of being mature and having it together. So from Juliet's standpoint, to make her most attractive, she would want to present herself as being most physically attractive, or most similar to Romeo. Now, there's some weird research in all of this when we start talking about similarity, right? There's this entire line of research called implicit egoism, which is arguing that we have this weird connection to people, that we find similarities in the oddest places. So, for example, when people's names are kind of similar to ours, we find ourselves more likely to be attracted to them. So my name, Brian, pretty common name. I'm more likely to be attracted to someone else with a really common name than someone with a less common name. There's weird research that finds that people's earlobe size tends to be rather similar to the earlobe size of people they're romantically attracted to. Now, we can't explain that with any kind of a knowledge that makes any sense, but the fact of the matter is people have gone to great lengths to try and determine what it is with respect to similarity that people tend to look at. And perhaps most difficult to say is that there's what's called a matching hypothesis, which is to say that we oftentimes find ourselves romantically attracted to people that are just about as physically attractive as we are. So when you talk about similarity, there's similarity in terms of physical attractiveness. So if Romeo looks at himself and figures he's about an 8 on a scale of 1 to 10, he's likely to be physically attracted to people that are also 8s, 9s, 7s, probably not 10s, and probably not 4s. Now, by the way, what about the question, don't opposites attract? I mean, already you're probably thinking of people that seem to be rather mismatched when it comes to physical attractiveness or any of the other possible similarity qualities. Well, that's what's called a complementary hypothesis. And the complementary hypothesis argues that we sometimes are attracted to people that have very different qualities than we do. And the argument there is that those different qualities make up for the gap that we don't have. So, if I'm an introvert, I might be attracted to an extrovert because that extrovert will balance out my introversion. So how does that work? Well, in the research, what we find is that the complementary hypothesis tends to be a better explanation of why we are romantically attracted to people in short-term romantic relationships. But for long-term romantic relationships, those that tend to work out over a long period of time, those people tend to be similar to ourselves. Or to put it differently, I can date someone or have a short-term romantic relationship with someone who's rather different than I am. We might have relatively less similarity. But if there's a stronger similarity, then the chances are that that strong similarity is going to allow me to have a long-term, successful romantic relationship. Next are what are called environmental factors. So environmental factors have to do with the context in which we meet people and the context in which a romantic relationship might be initiated. One dimension of environmental factors are what are called social networks. That's the network of friends and acquaintances and people you bump into over the course of time. And as you bump into them, that environment is one in which the romantic attraction might or might not take place. So we've been using Romeo and Juliet as an example of all this. The example now is that Romeo and Juliet take place in a particular social network. Romeo's got his friends, Juliet's got her friends. There's Romeo's family, there's Juliet's family. And in the Shakespearean play, the two families don't get along with each other. That forms a rather non-supportive backdrop to the romantic attraction. In fact, there's even this thing called the Romeo and Juliet effect, which is this idea that says that sometimes we are attracted to people because our social networks disapprove of them. This is the idea that sometimes adolescents will be attracted to someone romantically because their parents don't approve of them. And so being attracted to that person and perhaps entering a relationship with them creates a situation of rebelling against or pushing back against the parents during a time of life when you're trying to assert your independence. Regardless of what the environment looks like, proximity is the #1 determinant of romantic attraction. Here's what I mean by that. We tend to be more romantically attracted to people we interact with over and over and over again. Or to put it differently, the more often you see someone and interact with them, the more likely their attractiveness is to rise in your eyes. Now, that attractiveness is not necessarily a physical one, though it could be. It's just a general overall feeling of attractiveness to one person. Now, that doesn't mean that the more time you spend with someone, that it's inevitable you'll be attracted to them. Far from it. We're simply saying that of all the factors that might fit into making someone romantically attracted to someone else, proximity is the chief determinant of that. And that makes sense because that proximity allows for different kinds of interactions. It allows for interactions to occur over a period of time. And so it just broadens the basis for possible attraction. Now, as I said to begin this, it's very difficult to try and explain why it is people are attracted to one another in a romantic sense. In fact, science trying to explain that is, in the eyes of many people, a fool's errand. And that's because many people think it is so idiosyncratic that you can't make universal statements about it. Well, to whatever extent that's true, we also have to recognize that the research has been able to identify some of the things about which we've spoken in this brief module. And so, I'll leave it to you to determine how much of it is magic, how much of it is undefinable, and how much of it is the product of science. Regardless, that, in a nutshell, is what we know about the forces of romantic attraction.